I met Peggy Akers for the first time during the Occupy movement in Portland, Maine. Later on, when I joined the Veterans for Peace, Peggy was one of the first to greet me with a big hug. I'm happy to tell Peggy's story in this Warriors for Peace Veterans Speak series because Peggy spent a year in Vietnam as a nurse working in an intensive care unit where she not only performed life-saving tasks on a daily basis, but spent hours of her own time consoling the wounded and dying and just being there for them. Peggy's experience of war is different from those soldiers on the front lines who fought in the rice paddies in the jungles, killing and being killed. She saw the devastating results and the brutality of war in the form of horrendous wounds to soldiers on both sides, as well as to Vietnamese women and children. Her poem at the end of this profile sums up her experience in Vietnam. I'm happy and proud to tell Peggy's story.
Hi, my name is Peggy Akers. I am a member of Veterans for Peace Chapter 01 in Maine, and I was a nurse during the Vietnam War. I grew up in a little town outside of New York City called Croton-on-the-Hudson. It was a wonderful place to grow up. I spent all my years there until after high school. High school was a really important time for me. I was very involved in sports. I played basketball, played field hockey. I was a cheerleader, loved cheerleading. I was a Girl Scout. I was very involved in everything in school. I was president of my senior class and involved in all sorts of clubs during high school. But I always knew that I wanted to be a nurse, and I'm so grateful that I had a mom that wanted me to go to a 4-year nursing school so that I could get a degree, something that she always wished that she'd had that opportunity to go to school. When I went off to college, my father didn't really feel like women should have college degrees, or my father didn't support women necessarily getting supported to go to college, as my brother was in medical school at that time. And so when I went off to college to Columbia, a recruiter came to our school and was looking for Army nurses. And at that time, so this was in 1964, the Vietnam War was going on, and they were, looking for nurses, and I don't think I really realized that I'd ever end up in Vietnam, but I took the bait and I signed up for the military at that time, which was a decision that certainly changed my life in many, many, many ways. During the time that I was at school in New York City at Columbia, there were a group of us, of student nurses, who became involved in anti-war activities, and we hung, I think it was a sheet that we hung out of our window protesting the war. And then some of us ended up going down to the main campus of Columbia to help when the SDS was involved in some local activities down in that part of New York City. So it was ironic that I would end up signing up to go into the military at that time. I think there was a part of me that thought that the war would end and I would never have to go to Vietnam, but that's not how it turned out. So after I graduated from Columbia, the School of Nursing, I was during my last 2 years, I actually was a second lieutenant, and then I think during my senior year I became a first lieutenant, but nobody who was not in this program with me knew that we were in the military, but we had this officer status. But as soon as I graduated, it was like they were right there to take us right off to basic training in Fort Sam Houston. And we spent 6 weeks there just learning how to salute, basically, how to wear our uniforms. We did a little bit of medical training, learning how to debride wounds, and we learned how to find our way back from the forest, which of course we never had to use in Vietnam. And that was about it for basic training. And then we ended up getting orders, all of us, for different times and different places to go to another hospital. And I ended up going to to Fitzsimmons Hospital in Aurora, Colorado, where I worked on a cardiothoracic unit. And I think that was, for me, the beginning of seeing what happened in Vietnam to soldiers, and seeing the wounds that they came back with, and horrible, horrible chest wounds. And I think that I realized that what was going to be happening for me in Vietnam was going to be, very difficult and very sad. And soon after that, I got orders to go. I was in Colorado for 6 months, and then I got orders to go to Vietnam, and I went to a little hospital in Quy Nhon. It's called the 67th AVAC Hospital. So my experience at basic training, also sort of made me realize what these poor enlisted soldiers, and they were all men at that time, were going to go through. Because I remember that when we would be walking to classes, seeing this group of soldiers, all in their fatigues, with punji sticks, and they were walking in a circle, going, kill gooks, kill gooks, kill gooks. And it's like, I don't even think I had heard that word before. And it made me sick. And so that was, one of my experiences from basic training, sort of setting me up for what, was to happen. So I was a pretty young, unseasoned nurse when I got to Vietnam. I'd had 6 months in the cardiothoracic unit at Fitzsimmons, and then suddenly I'm in a intensive care unit at 67th AVAC Hospital in Quy Nhon. And the first day that I was taken through, on our tour, I saw one of my high school classmates there in the intensive care, and it just made me sick to see him. And he did survive, but it just like he was just a kid, and just, of course, I was felt like everybody was a kid over there, and so then he was shipped out. Off to Japan or somewhere, which is where severely wounded soldiers ended up going after they were stabilized. And I continued to work in the intensive care unit. And a typical day for us was, a couple of nurses, a couple of corpsmen working together, taking care of, soldiers as they came from the triage area or the surgical unit. And so I use this, sort of sharing, because I think a lot of people have watched MASH. And MASH, it might be funny, but it really told the story of Vietnam in many, many ways. I mean, I think about when at the beginning of MASH, when everybody runs out to the helicopters, and when we get notice that there's going to be wounded coming in. That's exactly what happened. I mean, everybody would, we all knew there were choppers coming in with wounded. And because during Vietnam they had these amazing, dust-off pilots that could go in anywhere and pick up these guys, they brought in these guys that would have never, ever, ever survived in another war, an earlier war. I mean, they could have lost, both their legs, their arms, horrible, horrible wounds. And so that's what we saw, every day, pretty much. And, you taught the word triage, is a word that I don't know if it started in Vietnam. it's a word that's used all the time now in every emergency room, but people are triaged, like who's the worst off. And in Vietnam, not everybody could be saved. And so some of the soldiers would have to be put behind curtains because you couldn't put all the energy into one person who probably wouldn't make it when there were 3, 4, 5 others that maybe you could, stop the bleeding and save their lives. And I think, like to this day, I think about those guys that, died alone behind those curtains, because we couldn't do everything. And it was a very, very helpless feeling. And we were always the ones when they came out of anesthesia that would be there. And, you wished, that a surgeon would be there to say, oh, we had to take your legs off, or we had to, take your arm off, and whatever, or you've lost your eye, or but it was always, we were the ones that were there because they were back in surgery with the next group of soldiers. And so it was always the nurses that were there when they woke up. And it was and for me, what I remember is feeling like what I had to do was to make them feel like they did it for a reason, that they did it for America. They did it for, I couldn't be angry, and I couldn't be sad, and I couldn't, I just couldn't be anything except like a mom or a sister, just to be there and to, to tell them how proud I was of them for, whether they saved their buddy or whatever they did, and we always tried to learn their stories and figure out, who was in their lives. And another part that for me that I think about all the time is, like today, we all have cell phones and parents are there, and whenever somebody's sick, I know where my kids are all the time, even though they're grown. I know if they're sick, and these kids had no way of being part of, their parents had no way of being part of their lives when all this was going on. And, like, it just, you just felt like that we had to be that parent, that sister, that wife, that girlfriend, that everything, just to tell them that, how beloved they were and how proud, that we were of them, for what they did. And, the other thing I just think about at night, when I worked a lot of nights, and we had this one phone, and there was we could use the, we had a way of calling, Phoenix, Arizona, and actually, I think it was Barry Goldwater's whole network. We had a way of using these radios that we could call Phoenix, Phoenix, and then they would call the parent, and then we could bring the phone over to these soldiers. So at night we would try so hard to get hold of, these kids' parents or their families, to let them, if they could, to talk to them, and it was really hard. And many of those guys died, and many of them, the wonderful medics that we worked with, we would together, we would put them in body bags, and someone would come and take them away to the morgue. And it was just an incredible experience for anybody to go through. I think it's just this, it was so sad, because each time you felt like you were losing part of your own family, because you really loved these guys. I think that, how did I deal with the pain and the sadness? At first, I cried. But then I realized that I was never going to stop crying if I cried all the time. And at night when you'd go back to your hooch, and usually your roommate was on a different shift, and so you had lots of alone time. I think what I did was I decided that I was just going to put my energy into friendships, and I had really good friends that were there. Mostly they were enlisted people, enlisted men, and we had figured out ways that we could be together at night and talk, and they would tell me about their wives and their children, and we would sing, and we would always be hiding. And then the other thing I did is I went back often. When I worked days, I'd go back at night and write letters with the guys on my ward, and read their letters to them, and just, I don't know, I spent a lot of time. I sound like a Pollyanna, but I think for me it was the most healing thing that I could do, was to stay involved in their lives, and and I think that's how I coped for a long time, just selfishly being part of their lives as much as I could. So one of the things that was very difficult about, working in a hospital and working within the military was that there was a very strict rule about fraternizing with enlisted men. And again, this is a different war. It was, there were not women soldiers there. There might have been some, but I certainly didn't know them. And so we were not allowed to fraternize. It was something we learned during basic training. But those were the guys that we loved too, because they were the ones that we worked with at night and day, and we were the ones that held these guys' hands as they died, and we did this together. And so once we stepped out of the hospital, there were, people we called lifers who probably, I want to say they supported the war, but I don't know whether they supported the war or not. I never really got to know the chief nurse, at least at the hospital in Quinlan. And so that's why we had to sneak, but we couldn't eat together. We couldn't, go anywhere together. The one place that we could go, that I would go, is I would go up to the USO when I could, and I would, so the guys, when they would come off these choppers and they were dirty, and they were just come out of the field, and you'd be walking up there, and I had pigtails and I had blonde hair, and they would look at you like they would look through you, but all you needed to do was say, "Hey, how's it going?" and start talking to them, and oh my God, it was just like they, and they started telling you about their kids, their families, their wives, their girlfriends, and the USO was one place you could go and actually sit, and you could sit with an enlisted man, and because it was not military, they weren't paying for it, sponsoring it, I don't know, but so that was really a fun thing to do, and to talk to the guys when they came in from the field. There were always a couple of us that were rebels, I'd say. We wore ribbons in our hair, and we wore smiley buttons, things that that you weren't really supposed to do. And so there was one incident that I remember that I think was our way of sort of rebelling against the war, because we really didn't have a way of doing it. We certainly couldn't do it, and we were taking care of these soldiers, and we, on Sundays, the lieutenant colonels and the generals would come through and pin Purple Hearts on all these, half bodies that were laying there, and so one night, it was during the day. One day, there were I think 3 of us that went to the officers' club, 3 nurses, and we never really talked about, like how we felt about the war. I think that we just didn't know how to do that, and we just, without feeling like we were somehow letting these guys down who were coming in with these horrendous, horrible wounds, and so what we did is we went to the officers club, which we were officers, and when you go to the officers club, everybody has hats, and you take your hat off and you put it in. There was a place where you could put a coat and a hat, and we took all the hats that were there, which were obviously all officers' hats. I don't remember how many, but there were a lot. We brought them back to the nurses' quarters, and we dug a hole. I don't think we had planned this specifically. It just happened. We dug a deep hole, as deep as we could, And it was behind the nurses' quarters, and we put the hats in there with some newspaper, and we burned them. And there were people that watched. Some of the doctors watched. I think they were like probably afraid if they got involved, they'd be court-martialed or something. And then we covered it up, and it was just like we never spoke about it again. We just never did. But I think it was, and I haven't really shared this story until very recently, and I really think it was our way of just protesting the war, but without, being hurtful in any way to, these guys who we just had to make them believe that everything that they lost was because it was, for our country, even though we didn't really believe that. I think we all hated the war. I mean, I think every single one of us who worked in medicine there, who was in the hospital, hated the war. You just didn't. The doctors had all been drafted mostly. They weren't like volunteer doctors, they were drafted. So I think we all hated it, but nobody knew, how to stop it. It was our way of like trying to, burn out the hatred, and I don't ever remember us really talking about why we did it. But I know why we did it. We all knew why we did it, because we did not like these people that were making all the rules and making, the decisions about, going and taking a hill, that's exactly what would happen, is that they would send them to a hill or, some mountain somewhere, and then, then 20 of them would get killed. It was just, and then we'd get the rest at the hospital. And I think that's what's so amazing about also the wall in Washington, is that you can go up to it, and for me, it's like remembering a certain night, that they overran, a certain area, and they were, slaughtered. And these guys, I didn't know any of the ones that, that were killed before, but some of them, the ones that came to the hospital and died, then I remembered that night. I might not remember each name, but I can go to the wall and touch the wall, and from that night. That's how it's all. That's how the wall is made, is by when you died. And I think that was just a really thoughtful way to put those names on there, so that we can even though we might not have known them, we knew that night, and we can still grieve for them and think about them. I returned home alone, as we all got orders alone, so it wasn't like I came with a group of other nurses and we were all discharged back to the States. So I still had another year of service that I owed them, and I was sent to Fort Lewis in Washington. I got out of the service there. I finished my year. I took all my uniforms, put them in a garbage bag, and threw them away. Took my little Beetle. I had a little Volkswagen Beetle with my peace signs all over it and my skis on the back, and I just took off. I moved to Alaska, and I was working in Alaska. And in 1980, it was a time when, during Pol Pot in Cambodia, the Vietnamese were taking over, coming through Cambodia and pushing the Cambodians out. And the Cambodians were coming across the border in Thailand, and they were setting up refugee camps. And I was asked to go as a nurse, as part of an agency in Alaska, and so to the refugee camps. And I think a part of me thought that if I was going to go to Cambodia, I would get back to Vietnam, and which I think I just needed to do. I had some work to do. I just felt like I needed to go back to Vietnam and find out what happened to all those, Vietnamese kids and just, everything. And so I did. I worked in the refugee camp, but it was like being back in Vietnam. It was, like in a different way. But at night there was, you could hear the bombing and you could hear, the war going on. And then, these kids came across the border, were just starving, and people were dying. It was in a different way. It was like Vietnam, and of course, I never, was able to really leave the camp. I never, got back to Vietnam. But then I knew that at that time, that I wanted to do more with my nursing, and I went back to San Francisco and went back to school, and became a nurse practitioner. And it was during that time that I wrote a poem about my experiences. It was, I started to get some flashbacks. When I would hear the helicopters coming into the hospital and it was a hot day, that when it's, it just triggered, like I just started crying a lot and just really remembering a lot about Vietnam. And this is a lot of years later. And then one night I saw on television a show about vet centers. And the first vet center in the United States had opened in San Francisco. So the next day I actually called the TV because they didn't say where it was, and they told me it was in the Haight-Ashbury. And so the next day I walked down there and went in and there were these, combat vets that were managing it, and they'd never had a woman walk in before, and they hadn't really thought about women, and they thought I really wanted to volunteer to sort of help, and I don't know. So I ended up in this group with these combat vets, and it was just horrible. I was right back in Vietnam again because they all sort of looked to me to take care of them, and they were still in Vietnam in their heads. At night they would go off and shoot guns in the air. And they were just, they were really struggling with their experience. But I fell in love with each and every one of them. It was just, they were great. And, so that's really when I started to, for me to just remember some of the stuff about Vietnam and talk about it. Not so much at the vet center, but, I think I got into my own counseling and the most healing thing for me was getting involved with Vietnam veterans that were doing peace work, and that was what for me was the beginning of my healing. When I was in San Francisco and I got involved I went to the vet center. I actually met some veterans who were activists also at that time. They had been involved in Vietnam Veterans Against the War. They were speaking out, and it was during the time of Nicaragua and our opposition to the Sandinistas, and so at that time I went with a group of veterans to Nicaragua. Or at some point I did that, and we were speaking out frequently in high schools and doing teach-ins about the war in Vietnam and our experiences. And I'm very, grateful to that period of time in my life because I really felt like that was so healing. I think that, I had a special story to tell because my experiences were so different from, the soldiers themselves, because I never really saw the war. I just heard it and, smelled it and, felt it and saw what war did to people. And I think that that's a very important part of the story of Vietnam. And I'm glad I had that, opportunity to share my story, in many, many classrooms in San Francisco. And, today, I mean, it's, I was there in 1970, so that's like a long time ago, and yet I think that my experience there is part of my life every day. I have the privilege of taking care of patients who come from many war-torn countries, from Iraq, from Rwanda, Burundi, Djibouti. I see wounds on them where they've been tortured, where they've been, macheted. They, just have horrible, horrible wounds from war. And I feel this incredible, responsibility, to share their story in my notes, even when I write their stories in my medical notes, because I want somebody to read that and to know what war does to people, because I know what war does to people, and I feel that same horrible pain, when I know what they've been through. So when I was living in San Francisco, I was invited to be on the national board of Veterans for Peace, and that was when they had an office here in Portland, Maine. And I remember coming here in the middle of the winter, and Jack Bussell, who's a beloved member of Veterans for Peace years ago, would meet me at the airport and bring me to these meetings when Jerry Genesio and Doug Rawlings, who now is a dear friend, were involved. So I've been a member for a long time. I've sort of drifted in and out of Veterans for Peace, but I've always believed in what their goals and their dreams and their hopes are for peace in this world. And so I've always stayed semi-involved. But when I came back to Maine, I did become more involved, and for a short time I was president with another veteran, and it was during the time when we had a wonderful member named Tom Sturdivant, who our chapter is named after now, and I feel like Tom is, like even today, Tom is here. He was really my inspiration, because he was a doer. He was a doer. It wasn't that he was a doer always marching in a parade, though he did that all the time. But he built gardens, and he took care of people, and just reached out in a million different ways, to people in his community, and his family, and his with other veterans, and I feel like that's why I feel when I'm taking care of patients that I feel like I'm doing Veterans for Peace work then too. It's not just when I'm marching with them, or doing a Veterans for Peace event. I feel like Veterans for Peace is part of my everyday life, and I feel really proud of what they've done and what they're doing, and I'm really grateful that there's such an organization that I can be a small part of. I don't really pretend to be a politician or have great knowledge about the history of the wars in the Middle East or in Southeast Asia, though I have read a lot, and or even what's going on in Ukraine now. But I feel a great responsibility, being a Vietnam veteran, in sharing what war does to people, what war does to families. It's like, I think that I really believe, it's like I'm not for the draft, but part of me is for the draft. It's like I just wish that if every politician who makes these, sends soldiers overseas, to fight these wars, and what more soldiers are going to Iraq right now, if they would send their children, really their daughters, their daughters and their sons when they're 18 years old into those war zones, that they would feel differently, that they would sit down at a table and try to figure out a way. When I look at what's going on, I work with, with a community up in Lewiston, that I love, a Somali community. And, they are a community of peace. And to think, in so many ways, I really believe that we've created all the hatred that young people have against this country, that we've created it by what we do. I mean, we celebrate when a drone goes in and kills somebody, whether they're good or bad, or, it doesn't matter. We celebrate it. And it's like, how can we do that? I mean, what if that was our son? What if that was, it was my child? Like, I'm going to do everything, to protect my children and the children that I see in every country. I mean, they're children. And I remember that about Vietnam. You know, I just remember, you know, like, you know, do we as, you know, especially as mothers, teach our children, you know, to go and kill another mother's child? No. I mean, we should be teaching our children to be, you know, children of peace. I mean, that's what that mothers should be doing. And so, you know, like if you know, now mothers as politicians, you know, they should send their children, send them. If they're going to support a war, then they need to go first, you know. And so that's how I feel about, you know, wars. It's just, you know, it's like I'm not going to pretend to be an expert, you know, on them, but I certainly feel like I have some expertise about what happens to people's bodies, you know, when they're blown up. And that makes me really sad. When I lived in San Francisco and I was beginning to remember a lot of the things that happened to me and what I saw in Vietnam, and it was Memorial Day, and I remember sitting down and writing this poem, and I'm not a poet, but I didn't know what to do with it. So I looked up the number of the San Francisco Chronicle, and I called it, and I said, "City desk, please." That's exactly what I did. And I read my poem, and the guy says to me, "Who are you? Who are you?" And I hung up. But this poem is you know, very much my story. It's called A Poem for Memorial Day. Dear America, remember me? I was the girl next door. Remember when I was 13, America, and rode on top of the fire engine in the Memorial Day parade? I'd won an essay contest on what it meant to be a proud American. And it was always me, America, the cheerleader, the Girl Scout, who marched in front of the high school band, carrying our flag, the tallest, the proudest. And remember, America, you gave me the Daughters of the American Revolution Good Citizen Award for Patriotism, and I was only 16. And then you sent me to war, America, along with thousands of other men and women who loved you. It's Memorial Day, America. Do you hear the flag snapping in the wind? There's a big sale at Macy's, and there's a big parade in Washington for the veterans. But it's not the American flag or the sounds of drums I hear. I hear a helicopter coming in. I smell the burning of human flesh. It's Thomas, America, the young black kid from Atlanta, my patient, burned by an exploding gas tank. I remember how his courage kept him alive that day, America, and I clung to his only finger and whispered over and over again how proud you were of him, America, and he died. And fam, he was only 8, America, and you sprayed him with napalm, and his skin fell off in my hands, and he screamed as I tried to comfort him. And America, what did you do with Robbie, the young kid I sat next to on the plane to Vietnam? His friends told me a piece of shrapnel ripped through his young heart. He was only 17. It was his first time away from home. What did you tell his mother and father, America? Hold us, America. Hold all your children, America. Alan will never hold anyone again. He left both his arms and legs back there. He left them for you, America. America, you never told me that I'd have to put so many of your sons, the boys next door, in body bags. You never told me. It was like yesterday, you know. Isn't that weird? It's like so long ago.
The answer never was, never will. We will never live in peace unless and until we learn to love each other, not bomb, maim, and kill. 'Cause war is not the answer, never was and never will. Some may say we're crazy, stupid, and naive. We will never live in peace, 'cause wars will always be. Well, I believe it's possible if we join hand in hand to create a better world with peace in every land. 'Cause war is not the answer, never was, never will. We will never live in peace unless and until we learn to love each other, not bomb, maim, and kill. 'Cause war is not the answer, never was, never will. 'Cause war is not the answer, never was and never will.
don't mean nothing, we said to the man. When we're fighting in that Vietnam land, the people didn't want us, you could see it in their eyes. And we were all very shaken by our own country's lies. But we kept on doing what we were trained for. Some 58,000 of us went knocking on heaven's door. We came home hurting, but nobody cared. And we still cry inside and we wake up scared. Well, some of us take it with a lot of doubt. Too many of us break down and we just check out. We're searching for meaning of that goddamn war, while the rich stack their treasures and laugh with a roar. And working class people send their children off to war.